Okay, out on the range. So here we are. It is the winter. It's really started. Next week's Christmas. I guess this week's Christmas. Man, time flies. What are we talking about here? How about the change of the seasons? We've got winter, which is the death of the seasons. The leaves have all fallen. It snowed on and off. Things are at the end of their season. And many people can't cope with the idea of death. They can't acknowledge that their life's coming to an end, right? But here's the thing. Once you actually acknowledge that you're already dead, that's when you can start living. Many people resist this idea of life having an end, and it puts them in this state of fear where they can't actually perform. They're so much in a defense, so much in a retracted state that they can't move forward, create, grow, and experience life. This is really what causes you to have the mindless masses. And in history's past, there's been many men who are considered great that got over this fear. Alexander the Great, Jesus Christ, the founding fathers signing their name on the Declaration of Independence, their own death warrants, many men. And it's through this conquering the fear of death that you end up truly becoming alive. Now, I have worked on this, and I think there are two ways that you can actually conquer the fear of death. This is something not many people know. The first, and I think is very effective, but is not the ultimate, is you can become so strong, so capable, so tough that you literally fear no other men or consequences from other humans. When you become a warrior or some type of almost delusionally confident person that you're not worried about repercussions from anything you do or say, you end up conquering this fear of death for the most part. And then you unlock your creative potential, your ability to actually express, to say what you want to say, to do what you want to do, to take action when you need to take action. It's powerful. And you have to, one, prove to yourself through hardship, endurance, taking on tasks that most people never would, being in a fight, surviving through that fight. You then become able to conquer this fear of death. Now, this doesn't mean you're invincible, but the result is that you become someone with an elevated status. This elevated status leads to higher testosterone, less cortisol in your system, less weight in your mind, bogging you down, thinking about all the ways that things could happen negatively. Very powerful. This is, you see it often from people who are leaders of countries. You see it in animals that are alpha primates. You have a gorilla that's a silverback. They're not afraid when they've already beaten the other gorillas. You have lobsters. That's Jordan Peterson's thing. If you give a lobster who's been beaten by other lobsters SSRIs, it increases their serotonin so that they actually think that they are a winner. And then they end up puffing back up. And then they end up taking on other lobsters in fights and sometimes succeeding thereafter just through confidence and getting back on top of the social hierarchy so that they have more rights to mating, resources, whatever it is that they want. This is powerful. And it's not the ultimate way to overcome the fear of death, but it can get you through the gap from being in this shallow, low density, just not being able to accomplish anything, kind of stagnant state that keeps you paralyzed from actually progressing in life, learning and growing and taking action to actually become better, to look into deeper things, etc. I would never knock anyone for taking that path. I took that path. I did karate when I was very young, 14. It was because I had kids in my neighborhood who were trying to beat me up. And I realized I had to do something about it, and I learned how to fight, and I learned how to fight very well. I fought when I was a teenager, grown men who'd been through the military, and sparred with them. And I would get beat up by them, but it built up my confidence. And then I went on into the military myself, and I learned all the skills of survival, and I learned how to fight, and I even went to Iraq. It built up my confidence. And then I took on other tasks. I learned how to survive financially, building my own business. I learned how to lead other men and make things happen, how to accomplish things in the real world. All of it made me so that I wasn't in this state of fear that most of the mindless masses are in. Some people call them an NPC. It allows your mind to unlock so that you're more creative, and you don't just pay attention to the immediate things that are potentially dangerous to you. You can actually think of bigger things. You can see solutions. You can end up growing. These are great, but it's not the ultimate, because here's the problem. The second that you run into an obstacle that you are overwhelmed by, an obstacle where you're unable to actually defeat it, and maybe you lose a little bit of your delusional confidence, and you realize that you're going to get old one day, and other men could beat you, that you can't take on 20 men all on your own, things like this. It causes you to slip, and it causes you to go back into that fear state where you're no longer able to be more tapped into bigger picture in God. And that's where the second way of overcoming the fear of death comes to fruition. So this is something well known in history past, and that is the people who believe in an afterlife. If you believe that when you die, you're going to go to a place that is heaven, then this world really doesn't matter. And you don't have a fear of the things of this world if you truly believe that you're going to go on. If you think that there's more to this life, that when you die, it's just not an end, that you actually know you have a soul, then you can overcome the fear of death, especially if you believe it wholeheartedly. Now, it doesn't even have to be that you're a Christian, that you're a Buddhist, that you're a Muslim. Just that mere belief on its own is enough to cause you to get over your fear of death and tap into the eternal, tap into God. This is super powerful. Now, most of the world right now, a huge chunk of it, is very atheistic, nihilistic, doesn't really believe in anything spiritual, doesn't have a higher power, these type of things. And I mean, it was Nietzsche who said that God is dead and I have killed him and we are worse for it. People usually only say the first half of that quote, that God is dead. Now, in that world, you go into a very Darwinian state where it's survival of the fittest, and you go back to the first method of just being the strongest person, and that what gets you over your fear of death, right? Now, as science has progressed, the physicists, the metaphysicists, I mean, people who study evolution, who study how the world in mathematics works, many of these people, towards the end of their careers, if you pay close attention, end up actually admitting or acknowledging in some way that there is a God, that there is some greater force, that there is something bigger in the universe that allows us to exist. I think this is just an acknowledgement of what people in the past had already known. And back in times previous in ancient history, they didn't have as good of ways to describe it, especially that fits in with modernity nowadays. So, how do you get this belief in God? How do you get this understanding that there is a greater power in all these things? Well, you have to understand that there's a lot of complexity to this world, and you have to study how things work. You have to understand the basic principles of reality. And what it all comes down to is you realize that there has to be, no matter what, some type of underlying force, some creative force that has brought us here, and that is God. Once you can acknowledge that, and then you can start to parse out why God made this creation, you can start to have comfort, or you can start to have some type of belief again that there's a greater purpose. Once you have that, and you can get at peace and know that this life, it doesn't just end when you die, you can make peace with that death, and you can overcome your fear of it. Um, this has long been written about. There's been rituals in the past that the Greeks and other esoteric teachings and people in the past have done to overcome their fears of death. You had the oracles of Delphi in Greece. The story goes that Alexander the Great went to these oracles, demanded to know his future, and went through rites where they would induce them into a drugged out state where they would perform chants, and almost, some say it was maybe a psychedelic experience that caused people to end up seeing God and knowing the bigger picture. And that's what allowed many of the greats in history past to overcome that fear. This is, if you get deep into ancient history, you'll brush against these type of things. They happen over and over again. But the bigger point is, and this is the real threshold that we stand at, the doorway we have to pass through to understand, why are we afraid of dying? Why are we afraid of coming to an end? Why does it even matter? Right? Because you could say maybe it's a fear of hell, maybe it's a fear of going into a place of torture when we come to an end, etc. Right? I don't incline towards that's the reason. Because yes, that could be a potential, that could be what happens, and that could be a motivator. But you have to realize there are many groups of people throughout the world and through history that had no concept of hell. They had no concept of an afterlife of torture. There were islands that were isolated. They didn't have that lore. There were people in the Amazon who didn't have any study or learned knowledge of theology like we do today, or other parts of the world did in the past. But yet they still had fear. They still had this fear of death. You could say it's biological. You could say that it's just an evolutionary pressure to keep some perpetual motion machine of DNA replicating, continually moving. I don't think that's what it is. I think it's much more subtle, and I think that it's much more deep than that. Why worry about coming to an end? Let's imagine now that we have came to an end, that we have died. This is an exercise I've heard other people do. Let's say that your life is over, you have nothing left to do, everything is done, every deed that you've done is now complete. There's no changing anything. You have no future. You have no dreams or aspirations that you can pursue any longer. All the things that you did, you regret. They've happened, and there's nothing you can do to change them. But the world simply goes on, and you have to let go of your narrative, of your identity, of who you are, and realize that as things continue on, you just played a part of it. And to try and struggle and hold on to you being a part of it, you're not able to anymore. You just have to make peace with it. This is a sombering moment as you think this through. this makes us consider now, maybe it's not so much about a tortured afterlife, or it's not about dying and no longer being able to, satiate your wants or desires or your goals and all these other aspirations. Maybe it's we fear death because we can't be a part of what creation is, about being the process, about being a part of God's mission. We're no longer connected to God because now that we're dead, we can't be a part of what is the greater force. We're now cut off. Even though we have to go through pain and trial and suffering and all these things to be a part of that creative force, it's still what we really deeply crave, is to be a part of creation, the growth of the universe, of society, of culture, of humanity. And that's what really living is. And to die is to not be a part of that process. So they say, what is it? Some men lead lives of quiet desperation, which is desperation or something like that. But really, some men live, some women live, but they never truly live because they're stuck in that state of fear, that state of just thinking, if I try, I fail, and then I don't succeed, I end up not being a part of that creative force. But you have to realize that just because you exist doesn't mean you're a part of that creative force. Just because you breathe, just because you can think, doesn't mean that you're really living. It's when we take on the mission, we take on the task, we take on what God is doing, that is when we truly live. And that is when we shape ourselves to become more pure, or maybe, the forces of the universe and God are shaping us. When we take on the task of growing, creating, learning, building, being courageous, waking up every day and making the world, as you might say, a better place, that's when we really live. And that's how we can overcome our fear of death. When we sit back and we say the true death is the inaction, it is the never having truly lived or done anything as a part of this grand scheme, this grand mission. I shouldn't say scheme, that sounds a little too negative. It's not a scheme, the holy divine mission. Yeah. So if you want to overcome your fear of death, you have to understand what it is that we're really doing here. Just being tough and strong isn't enough. You have to be willing to say there's a greater purpose, there's a greater mission that we're here for. And that is what will actually give you something to die for, something to stand up for. Your death becomes irrelevant. That's the big thing right now, is nobody has anything that they're willing to die for that I meet. There's no principle they would stand on. There's no honor that they would have that they would put above life itself, because they think the end is the end. But if you can truly understand that this never ends, this is an eternal process of growth and creation and eternity and exploring all that could be. And when you take the actions of being a part of that, that's when you truly live. That's when you stay in the vine, the one that Christ talked about. So if you want to overcome death, you have to understand that we're here for a greater purpose. If you want to understand more what that greater purpose is, I'm happy to help teach and show what that is. But the real crux of it is seeking truth. And through that seeking truth, it's eternal. It's a process. It's not a destination. Thanks, guys. That's all I have for today.